It was an evening show that everyone was buzzing about. The talk show that brought together Hollywood's biggest stars for live interviews and sharp, often biting humor. Sandra Bullock and Clint Eastwood were invited as the evening's special guests. They had both earned their place in Hollywood, but the talk show host had a reputation for stirring the pot and pushing celebrities to their limits. As they walked onto the stage, the audience gave them a standing ovation, applauding their impressive careers. Clint, with his usual calm demeanor, nodded to the crowd, his face as stoic as ever. Sandra smiled, always warm and engaging, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she sat down beside Clint. The host, a brash and self-assured figure, wasted no time in launching into his questions. "Sandra," the host began, "you've been in the business for decades, yet you've always managed to avoid controversy. Don't you ever feel the need to stir things up a bit? Maybe create some drama?" Sandra raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked this kind of question, but there was something in the host's tone that hinted at something more, something disrespectful. Clint, sensing the change in the atmosphere, sat up straighter. He could tell this interview was about to take a turn. The host continued, "And Clint, you've played tough guys for years. But let's be honest here. How much of that persona is real? You're a tough guy in movies, but in reality, you've been in the background for years. Is it all just an act, or is there more to it than meets the eye?" The crowd grew quieter. Clint's expression remained unreadable, but Sandra could feel the tension in the air. She could see where this was going. The host wasn't just asking questions, he was trying to humiliate them. But Sandra wasn't one to back down. She leaned forward, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You know," she said calmly, "I don't think you understand something important. Creating drama for the sake of drama isn't really our thing. We've built our careers on being real and doing things with integrity. If that's not enough for you, then maybe it's not us who need to change." The host, momentarily caught off guard, tried to regain his composure. But before he could speak, Clint's voice cut through the tension. "I don't need to act tough," Clint said slowly, his deep voice commanding attention. "I've lived tough. What you see in movies is fiction. What you see in real life is what you get." The host, now visibly rattled by Clint's calm but firm response, hesitated for a moment. The audience, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew quieter. The man who had once been in control of the conversation now looked uncertain. Sandra noticed this and couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. She had seen Clint stand his ground countless times, but there was something truly remarkable about the way he did it. Always measured, always composed. It was as if he knew exactly how to dismantle anyone trying to get under his skin. The host, now trying to salvage the situation, threw a glance at Sandra. "Well, Sandra," he said with a slight sneer, "you're often seen as the girl next door in Hollywood. You've made a name for yourself in these wholesome roles. But come on, do you ever feel like you're missing out on the edgier side of Hollywood? Are you too afraid to take risks?" Sandra, who had always managed to maintain her grace under pressure, didn't flinch. She straightened up in her chair and, with a calmness that seemed to radiate from her, responded, "Being true to who I am is my biggest risk. Not everyone can wear that as a badge of honor. Some people need to tear others down to build themselves up. But I'll stick with being genuine." There was a brief silence before the crowd erupted into applause. Sandra's words were sharp but thoughtful, and the host seemed to realize that his attempt to bait her had backfired. Clint, however, wasn't done. "You know," Clint said, his voice steady and unyielding, "there's no real risk in trying to humiliate someone for a laugh. It's easy, but showing up day after day and staying true to your beliefs, that takes real courage. You should try it sometime." The host, now on the defensive, opened his mouth to retort, but Clint cut him off. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about how many people you can make laugh at someone else's expense. It's about how many people you can lift up even when it's difficult." The host sat back in his chair, stunned by the bluntness of Clint's words. The audience, which had initially been uncomfortable with the direction of the interview, was now fully on Clint and Sandra's side. The tables had turned, and The rude host who had once been in control now found himself humbled in front of a live audience. The atmosphere in the studio was tense, yet oddly satisfying for anyone watching from the outside. The host, clearly out of his depth, shifted in his seat, now on the back foot. He had expected to provoke Clint Eastwood and Sandra Bullock, perhaps get a rise out of them, but instead, he had gotten a reality check. The energy in the room had completely flipped, and the audience was now entirely in Clint and Sandra's corner. Sandra could feel the change. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about the words. It was about the respect that Clint had shown her, and the respect they were now demanding from the host. "You know," Sandra began, her voice steady, "people love to tear others down because it makes them feel powerful. But the truth is, real strength comes from lifting people up, not putting them down." Her words were simple but impactful. Sandra had always been the type to let her actions speak louder than her words, but in that moment her words carried weight. Clint nodded, his expression never changing. "Exactly," he said. "And sometimes the biggest risk is just showing kindness when the world expects you to do the opposite. It's easy to be rude, to be dismissive. It's hard to be kind." The host, now visibly frustrated, tried to regain control of the situation. He attempted to change the topic, asking Sandra about her latest film, but the tension in the air remained palpable. The audience was no longer interested in his questions. They were more captivated by Clint and Sandra's strength in the face of ridicule. The host had tried to belittle them, but instead, they had shown everyone in the room what real power looked like. With a half-hearted chuckle, the host finally gave up, realizing that no matter what he said, he wasn't going to get the reaction he wanted. Sandra turned to Clint, giving him a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. Clint simply nodded, his eyes full of understanding. They didn't need to say anything more. They had made their point, and it had resonated far beyond the confines of the interview. As the interview came to a close, the host stumbled over his words in an attempt to wrap things up. "Well, that's all the time we have for today," he said, his voice uncertain. The camera zoomed out as Clint and Sandra stood up, and the audience erupted into applause. As Clint and Sandra walked off the stage, the air in the studio seemed to shift. The host, still sitting at his desk, looked bewildered, caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events. It wasn't often that someone turned the tables on him so effortlessly, and certainly not with such grace and power. The audience, however, was still buzzing. People in the crowd stood up, clapping and cheering, their applause not just for the star power of Clint Eastwood and Sandra Bullock, but for their integrity, their composure under pressure, and the respect they had shown when it mattered most. The world was watching, and the message had been clear. Kindness, strength, and standing up for what's right were far more impactful than any cheap shot or attempted humiliation. Backstage, Sandra looked at Clint and laughed softly, her eyes twinkling with appreciation. "I wasn't sure where that interview was going," she admitted, "but I knew you'd have my back." Clint smiled, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly. "It's what we do," he said simply. "We don't let people drag us down, and we don't let them drag anyone else down either." Sandra nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into her. It wasn't just about her standing up for herself. It was about defending others too. Clint's quiet strength had reminded her of that. As they walked out of the studio, the producers and crew members who had witnessed the exchange came over to offer their congratulations. "That was incredible," one of the producers said, shaking Clint's hand. "I've never seen anyone handle an interview like that." Sandra smiled, her heart full. "It wasn't just Clint," she said. "It was the two of us. Together we made a statement." Later that evening, clips of the interview flooded social media. People shared the moments when Clint and Sandra had turned the tables on the rude host. The comments flooded in, most of them in support of Clint and Sandra, praising their response and their message. "That's how you handle disrespect," one user commented. "They stood their ground and never let him get under their skin." Another post read, "Clint Eastwood and Sandra Bullock just taught us all a lesson in class, strength, and dignity." For Clint and Sandra, the incident was over, but the ripple effect of their powerful response was just beginning. They had shown the world that no matter how tough or how famous you are, standing up for yourself and others with dignity and respect will always make the most lasting impact. The next day, the talk show host's ratings plummeted. The backlash from the public was swift and unforgiving. The segment with Clint Eastwood and Sandra Bullock, once intended to be a moment of ridicule, had backfired in the most spectacular way. People weren't just watching the interview, they were sharing it, discussing it, and standing behind Clint and Sandra for their courage and composure. It wasn't about the flashy drama that the host had hoped to stir up. It was about the raw authenticity that Clint and Sandra had brought to the table. For Sandra, the aftermath of the interview was a reminder of the importance of staying true to who you are, regardless of the pressure to conform. She had been mocked by the host, but in the end, she had shown that kindness, honesty, and strength could stand up to any form of ridicule. As for Clint, the entire experience was a testament to his enduring legacy. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. By simply being himself, steadfast, calm, and respectful, he had shown what it truly meant to be a class act in a world that often favored spectacle over substance. Later that week, Clint and Sandra attended an event together. They were greeted with applause wherever they went, their names now synonymous with dignity and strength. The talk show host, on the other hand, was left to deal with the fallout of his own actions. His attempt to humiliate two Hollywood legends had turned into an unforgettable lesson for everyone watching. The true power lies not in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. As they stood together at the event, Sandra leaned in toward Clint, smiling. "You know," she said, "we make a pretty good team." Clint grinned back, his eyes twinkling. "We always have," he replied, giving her a playful wink. And as the crowd gathered around them, Clint and Sandra knew that no matter what the world threw their way, they would always have each other's backs. The respect they had for each other was unshakable, and no rude comment, no matter how pointed or cruel, could ever take that away. Please subscribe to the channel for Clint Eastwood's respect. Thanks.